Shalom. My name is Mottel Baleston, and this is the very first episode ever of a new series here at GLC entitled Our Messiah is Jewish. For over 17 years, it was my privilege to serve as Messianic rabbi at a large Messianic Jewish congregation in the New York metropolitan area. I was born into an average Jewish home in Brooklyn, New York, the New York City area there. And I came from a background where all four of my grandparents were Jewish. Yet, at the age of 21, on a search for spiritual truth, I came to a born-again, saving faith that God had kept his promise to our Jewish people and had sent to us our Mashiach, as we say in Hebrew, our Messiah. And of course, the name of that Messiah when he walked the earth is Yeshua. The Western world today knows him as Jesus. And again, at the age of 21, I placed my faith in him and was born into the family of God. And so, very quickly from that time, the Lord called us into ministry. My wife, Deborah, is also a Jewish believer, also grew up in the Jewish community in New York City. At the time I came to faith, I was working in the dental industry and was on track for a career in that. But just several years after coming to born-again saving faith, I realized that the Lord was calling me into full-time outreach to my own Jewish people to bring to them the good news that our Messiah has come and that Jesus is that Messiah. It's been a wonderful journey of faith, and now 30 years I'm starting to put some of that teaching on video and making it available to a larger audience. For many years, my wife and I had the privilege of arranging, and I led a Messianic Jewish fellowship in northern New Jersey, in Montclair, New Jersey, where we met for a Shabbat service, a Sabbath service, every Friday night, where we would light the candles, the traditional Shabbos candles, and we would welcome in Shabbat, and we would have a Messianic Jewish service on Friday evenings. Then for approximately 17 years, it was my privilege to serve as either senior Messianic rabbi or associate Messianic rabbi at Beth Messiah congregation in North Jersey, and wonderful years of being able to see the Lord bring many of our Jewish people to a saving knowledge of him. That came to a conclusion about 2 years ago, and for these last 2 years, I've had opportunity to do a little more traveling and sharing about the Jewish roots of the faith, sharing why I believe that the Jewish scriptures tell very clearly that Yeshua, that Jesus is the Messiah. But let me share a little bit about my story, because my story of coming to faith is in some ways traditional for Jewish people of my generation, but it will also serve in these next few minutes to illustrate why it's oftentimes very difficult when Jewish people consider the claims of Jesus, why so many other things get in the way. Let me go back to my ancestors, my parents, great-grandparents, and grandparents. I come from an area in Eastern Europe known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was where successive Russian governments forced Jewish people to live because of prejudice. Over the years, our Jewish people have been subject to a lot of prejudice from people who went to church on Sunday but persecuted Jewish people on Monday. And my grandparents were in a situation in Eastern Europe, specifically in the Ukraine and in Poland, where it was common for them to be taunted by people, often in a violent way, people who considered themselves to be Christians. But in fact, the loyalty of those individuals was to a church institution rather than to Jesus as Messiah. And so in their teens, my grandparents were sent across the Atlantic on a steamship to go with their older brothers and sisters who were already in America. And so they landed in America, where this threat of violent persecution, simply because you were Jewish, was not there. Now, certainly they would be taunted, they would hear unpleasant things, but the thing that they had experienced in Europe would be gone. That would be alleviated. And once again, the persecution that they were fleeing from was the persecution of Jewish people being targeted, being maimed, being raped, being murdered by people who considered themselves to be Christians. Again, one of the reasons for this is because in many of the large institutional churches in Europe, there was a teaching known by theologians in a formal sort of way. It's called the teaching of contempt. And the contempt was a contempt toward the Jewish people. There was a mistaken view of theology. There was the idea that somehow the Jewish people were uniquely and solely responsible for the death of Jesus. And so their thinking and the twisted thinking of some of these theologies, there was the thinking that the Jewish people then deserve to be persecuted, deserve to be driven from one country to another country. Of course, the people who came up with that determination were not reading their Bibles, because very clearly we understand that no individual, no race of people, no one forced Messiah Jesus to the cross. He went there willingly out of love for you and for me. He was handed over by the Jewish high priests, but he was handed over to the Romans. And of course, it was the Romans who crucified him. We don't go around targeting Italians because the Romans drove the nails into the hands and feet of Messiah Jesus. But rather we recognize that it was the love of God that sent him to the cross. It was the predetermined plan of God that he go to the cross to die for the sins of all of mankind. But yet that very simple biblical truth was lost on a number of churches there in Europe who really held to a very violent anti-Semitism, something that was designed to separate the Jewish people from the Jewish Messiah. And so that real history of violent persecution was one of the things that informed the Jewish mind about their prejudice toward Jesus. You see, in the minds of my grandparents, they could not distinguish the theologies of these violent churches from the average Gentiles around them. They weren't going to stop and ask, well, are you an individual who believes in these wrong theologies, or are you a genuine Christian? There were probably very few genuine Christians in their area that they had access to. And so they had rather little opportunity to even observe the difference between a person who merely attends a church and whose loyalty is to a church institution versus a person who has a genuine heart relationship and is both a follower and a doer of the words of Messiah Jesus. So fleeing that anti-Semitic persecution, they made their way to America. We have the most records for my grandmother. She came over in 1908. Her name was Sarah Siegel. And we have the records we found online that show that she came over as a teenage girl to join her brothers who were already here in America, the Siegel family. And they all went to, what it was called at that point, for them, it was the Promised Land. It was the Holy Land, Brooklyn, New York. And that's where she met another young Jewish person, my grandfather, Isidore Baleston, and he had also come and joined his older brothers here in America. And they were married and had a family. They had 3 children, and the youngest of those children was named Samuel Aaron Baleston, and that's my father. And so I grew up in an atmosphere where I had heard the stories of persecution. My grandfather particularly warned me that the New Testament was something you stay away from. You're a Jew, God created you as a Jew, and you need to continue that heritage. And yet, at the same time, I wanted to understand what it was that other people believed. I came up and came of age during the 1970s, when a lot of gurus and cults had come to America. And so I watched different friends of mine get involved with all of these gurus and cults. Jewish kids with names like Moskowitz and Goldberg and Rubenstein, kids in my own city housing project in Brooklyn, which was about 90% Jewish. And as you saw this in the 70s, there were all these cults coming to America. And the cults had a particularly strong draw upon these young Jewish people. They were seeking answers. And the various false cults and gurus were offering answers. And so I watched as these different friends of mine seeking answers outside of the scriptures wound up going into these various lectures. I was intrigued. I certainly had a Jewish education. I went to public school. However, 2 days a week, my father sent me after public school. In New York City, there was a time release program where after public school, 2 days a week, you'd go to a private school, a religious school. So for 2 days a week, I went to Jewish school where I learned language, I learned the Hebrew letters, I learned how to appreciate our history. And yet at the same time, I saw the same kids who had gone to school with me going off and going into all of these different cults. I wanted to understand if there was a spiritual truth out there that could be known. I was on a spiritual search, and the Lord at the same time was drawing me to himself. When we come back, what we're going to do and what I will be sharing with you is the specific way in which I was impressed upon the fact that these cults did not have the answer, but the answer was found in my own Jewish Bible, which is the source of answers for all people, both Jew and non-Jew alike. Stay tuned. See you then. Shalom. I had started off sharing with you a little bit of the story of my family, my Jewish family, and talking about how a nice Jewish boy like myself, coming from an average Jewish home in Brooklyn, New York, came to faith that Yeshua, that Jesus was the Messiah. I had shared with you that my grandparents came from a rather traditional Jewish background. In Europe, they were observant, they were Orthodox, and coming to America were exposed to many different things. But they had escaped the violent persecution of Europe, were now in America. But however, they were concerned to keep their children and their grandchildren away from the sort of hatred and persecution that they had experienced from people who claimed to be Christians there back in Europe. And so I now found myself in the 1970s as a young Jewish person who was watching all of the spiritual ferment going around all these gurus and cults that had come to America, and saw that I had Jewish friends, guys that I went to to Jewish school with. In our after public school, 2 days a week, we would go to Jewish school. And I saw them being drawn to these various Eastern religions and gurus that were in the area. So they kept saying, Mottel, come with us. Let's go into the city. Let's jump on the subway. We lived in Brooklyn. So you'd get on the subway, and in 40 minutes, you'd be in Midtown Manhattan. You could be in Times Square. And so we would go on the subway. We would get ready to listen to this lecture. And we would go to, for instance, a Hare Krishna lecture, one of the Eastern religions. And so we would hear the fellow lecturing, and this is what they would say. They would say, if you want to know the truth of the universe, if you want to know that truth of all of the ages, here's what you have to do. First of all, you've got to dress all in white. Then you've got to shave your head. You've got to become a vegetarian. When you pray, you need to face toward India and pray in Sanskrit. And if you do all of these, Eastern Indian cultural things, if you look this certain way, dress this certain way, eat this certain way, you'll know the truth of the universe. And I'm not so sure I bought into any of that. It seemed a little silly. Now, on the other hand, I had other Jewish friends who went in the opposite direction. They became ultra-Orthodox. They, like myself, had grown up in average Jewish homes where we would go to synagogue, not every Shabbat, not every Saturday, but occasionally. And certainly we did our bar mitzvah, we did all these other things. But they had been pulled into the influence of an ultra-Orthodox group in the next neighborhood over. I grew up in one neighborhood in Brooklyn, but in the next neighborhood was Crown Heights. And Crown Heights is the headquarters of the Chabad movement, the Lubavitcher Hasidim. And the Lubavitchers would have an outreach to average Jewish young people like myself. And a number of my friends had gone with them. And they said, come to these lectures. And so we hopped on the bus and went off to Eastern Parkway and listened to the lectures of the shlichim, the emissaries of the Lubavitcher movement. And here's what they told me. They said, if you want to know the ultimate truth of the universe, what should you as a Jew do? Here's what they said. First of all, you need to dress all in black. You need to grow a full beard. You need to have payas, the side curls, as per the scripture. You need to eat only kosher foods. You need to bench, which is a certain type of praying. You need to face Jerusalem when you pray, and you need to pray in Hebrew. And if you do all of those outward cultural things, you'll know the truth of the universe. Well, you see, each different group had a different set of cultural things that I had to adopt in order to grab a hold of some ethereal truth of the universe. It seemed to me that if there was a God out there that could be known, if there was a God that I could somehow make a connection with, that God could be reached no matter how I was dressed, no matter if I had a shaved head or a beard, no matter what language I prayed in, no matter what direction I faced in, I could reach him because he was God. And it was at that moment that I had just about given up on trying to find that truth, having just dismissed all of these cultural answers, when I finally dared to admit to myself that the one pathway I had dared not really investigate were the claims of Jesus. You see, in my neighborhood, most of the people I saw who went to church on Sunday, who were not Jewish and went to church, were members of a large institutional church which had violently persecuted my own Jewish people back in Europe. Even in America, the few times that I was taunted for being Jewish was always by members of this particular church. And so there I was. I said, well, I'm not even sure I'm allowed to believe in Jesus. The only people I knew who believed in Jesus in my particular neighborhood were Italian. And I said, well, I'm not Italian. Maybe I'm not even allowed to believe in Jesus. It seems a little funny today to think about that. But as a young person growing up, the only people I saw who believed in Jesus were Italian. But, I was doing some reading. I said, maybe it just seems as though Jesus was Jewish. And so I started an investigation of my own. I had no idea of how to start. But, I said, I've got to try to find folks who know something about this. Tried going to a couple of churches, and they seemed like ethnic clubs. I said, well, let me go to a different sort of church. And went to one church that was kind of a Dutch church. This was in Brooklyn back in the 70s. And I went in there, and almost everyone had blonde hair and blue eyes. I said, well, I'm not going to even take a seat. They're going to know I'm an outsider, and maybe they're going to ask me to leave. Did not feel welcome. Finally, I said, let me read the book of Christianity. Let me try to understand it. Now, I'd always, again, been warned by the rabbi at my Jewish school and by other people. They would tell me, don't even touch a New Testament. They would warn me, kind of an old story from Europe. They'd say if you touched a New Testament, your fingers would burn in the place where you touched it. You don't want to touch a Christian Bible. So much superstition, clearly. But you see, again, understand that they were violently persecuted by people who had Christian Bibles. Most of the Jewish people in Europe lived in areas where there were very few Bible-believing churches. Again, the predominant church in those areas tended to be churches that were institutional and had a contempt toward the Jewish people and had been involved in violent persecution toward them. So I was a little unsure about it, but I said, I'll go to the library and find a full Bible, a Christian Bible. Now, of course, in a standard Bible, you have the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible. But this is the forbidden part, the New Testament, the part that's not in a Jewish Bible. And so a Jewish Bible will have a cover here and then a cover here at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so almost with trembling fingers, I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and opened up to this very first page of the New Testament, which I had been told was a handbook on how to persecute the Jewish people. It was written by anti-Semitic priests, and it was full of venom toward the Jewish people. That's what I had been told. However, when I read it, I was very surprised. Here's the first sentence of this forbidden New Testament. It says, "This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." So, 3 people are mentioned, and they are all Jewish. And so I was shocked. I was surprised. I didn't see anti-Semitism in this book, but rather I was reading the story of a Jewish boy. Yeshua is his name. It means the salvation of Jehovah. I'm reading the story of a Jewish boy born to a Jewish mother whose name is Miriam. If your name is Mary, that's a very fine name. That's a wonderful name. But it's an English word that was invented about 1,000 years ago. Her name is Miriam, the same as the sister of Moses. So I'm reading the story of a Jewish boy born to a Jewish mother who grew up in was born in a Jewish town of Bethlehem, same town that King David was born in, and then grew up in Nazareth, which was exclusively Jewish at that time, and at the proper time walked into his home synagogue, which he and his family regularly attended, Sabbath services. He walked into that synagogue, and in Luke chapter 4, he announces that he is the Messiah. What will you do with that? Will you accept me? As I continued to read about Jesus, I saw the Messiah that God had been promising to our Jewish people. Eventually, I needed to find someone who could explain this a little better to me, and got out the phone book and tried calling a few churches and asked them, do you know any Jewish people who believe in Jesus? Finally, and at that point, I was not yet a believer. They put me in contact with a man who has since become a good friend of mine, a man by the name of Vincent. And got to talking with him on the phone. He said, well, why don't you come over to the house? And went over to his home there in Brooklyn, and he told me that he was a Protestant minister. I said, well, I'll come anyway. And got to the door, and a fellow came to the door who looked like a rabbi. And I said, where's the minister? And he said, I am. Well, Vincent is from a non-Jewish background, but loves the Jewish people, has lived in Israel for years, speaks Hebrew, and has made his home very comfortable for our Jewish people. I sat down with Vincent, and he was able to take me through my own Jewish Bible and was able to show me the prophecies that God had given to our Jewish people about the coming of the Messiah. He was able to show me in Isaiah that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. He was able to show me in other places of the Hebrew Scripture, Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. One after another, all these prophecies fit only one person in Jewish history, Yeshua. After several sessions of him answering my questions, I bowed my head in faith and prayed to receive Yeshua, Jesus, as my Jewish Messiah. That was over 30 years ago. The Lord has since called us into ministry. The Lord has allowed us to see wonderful things as we've been in his ministry. So we appreciate you tuning in. This is just the first of what will be a good number of these messages on our program, Our Messiah is Jewish. My name is Mottel Baleston, and it's been a joy to share with you how God called me to himself.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.